Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Christian Bicassa. On today's show, we have a friend of mine, Leonard Schoenberger from Munich, Germany. This is a very special show for me because I personally love to travel, and Munich is a centralized zone for fly fishing. If you haven't thought about going there and traveling from that location to hit a number of different areas and or styles or species to fish, you really should consider this. Leonard runs and operates the waitinglist.com, which is a publication that really tackles the fringe benefits of fly fishing. Something that's very unique perspective. I highly recommend you check out the page, thewaitinglist.com. It's extremely enlightening when it comes to fly fishing. It covers all types of categories, gear reviews, etc. It is just a great publication. Leonard, it's fantastic to have you on the show today. A couple things. Leonard, you're a journalist by trade, so that makes you a researcher by trade, which is just fantastic. I can't wait to dive into that today. We're going to talk about the Munich area, how many different types of fishing you can get to, and what a great location to fly into, especially as a U.S. kind of traveler where you may be taking friends or you may be going as a group, et cetera, because you really offer the fishing opportunities, but you offer the fishing opportunities with all the European culture opportunities as well. And then we're going to wrap up the show today with some subject areas that are near and dear to my heart that I cannot wait to experience. And that is fly fishing in Slovenia for marble trout and the ho-ho, which is like or is it hoo-hoo maybe?
Exactly. It's like hoo.
Yeah, it's like a taimen style fish. So yeah, we got some great stuff coming down the pipe here today. So Leonard, great to have you on the show, man. Let's dive into this Munich area. So you grew up there, correct?
Exactly. I grew up just a little south of Munich on a lake called the Starnberger See. And basically, as a kid, I used to go down there and fish for perch, just with a fishing line, basically. And it somehow got me started. I don't have anybody in my family fishing, so I just picked it up for myself. And then when I got a little older, I got into fly fishing. And that was in my late teens, basically. And since then, I've almost exclusively fished with a fly rod.
Fantastic. And I know you've traveled all over the place. And in fact, you have a trip coming up to Iceland, if I recall.
Exactly. It's going to be in a week from now. And I'm very excited because I've never been there. I've always wanted to go there. From what I heard, it's one of the most amazing places to fish, I think, in general, really. And there are so many species you can target. I mean, obviously, salmon, but then also sea trout, brown trout, and Arctic char. And you can fish all day long, basically, because the sun hardly sets.
Right. And it's a lot like a lot of fishing in Europe where you have to have a guide. They operate on the certain beats, et cetera, of the river or waterways, et cetera. So it should be a great trip for you. I'm looking forward to hearing how it goes, man. I'm sure you guys are going to light it up.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited. From what I heard, the fishing is pretty good this year, and I can't wait to get there.
Yeah, man. Great. I cannot wait to hear about it. So let's talk about Munich in general.
Yeah.
And in your perspective on the variety of fishing available.
Yeah, right. So Munich is a very central city in Germany. It's easy to fly in from the US. And what's great about Munich is its location north of the Alps. So that means from touchdown in Munich, getting in a car, you'll be in Austria within an hour and a half. You'll be in southern Bavaria, which is like some really nice creeks and bigger rivers flowing out of the Alps. And then also Slovenia that you briefly touched upon is like very close, like a 4-hour drive. And so what Munich offers in a way is a lot of different styles of fishing and a lot of different species within very close range. And particularly like for Americans, you're used to big distances. Over here, it's all very close. And that's sort of what's so nice about it, that let's say you come here for a week, you can fish in 5 different countries very easily and still experience a bit of culture, around it. So you might go fish in the morning, and then in the afternoon you might go see a city that dates back 500 years, for example.
Right. And is a lot of that facilitated by the rail system as well, and train travel?
Exactly. Train travel is pretty easy across Europe. It's fantastic in Switzerland, for example. It's pretty good in Italy and Germany and Austria. But also, if you just end up renting a car, the highways are great. You're going to be in those countries within a couple of hours.
You have the freedom of a vehicle to get to direct
Yeah.
location, etc.
Yeah. And
Would you?
particularly like in Slovenia, it might be easier going by car because there are lots of remote valleys that only little roads go into. So a car just gives you a little more flexibility.
Yeah, and then you're not having to get off a train, figure out a car scenario to get to location,
Right,
etc.
right.
So the time savings may kind of equal itself out with logistics, etc.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. Excuse me. Wow. And you also talked about the travel. So one of the major concerns of U.S. travelers is communication, right? Oh, I'm going to go to Germany. I don't know how to speak German. How am I going to get around? What would you say about that from your perspective? I mean, I know you speak both languages quite fluently.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like if you come to Europe, basically everybody speaks some English. It's very good in the Nordics, in Scandinavia. People speak excellent English over there. Then obviously, Great Britain, France, Italy, Spain. It's a bit harder, but you can still get
Fumble your
around
way.
pretty easily. Yeah. Everybody speaks enough English for you, to give you directions, tell you what to do or what not to do, and particularly if you want to fly fish and end up taking a guide. The guides speak decent English, definitely enough for you to have a good time and understand everything.
Yeah. And when you're traveling like that, finding guides, finding the right kind of guide, do you have some kind of tips and tricks for that as well?
I mean, I feel like taking a guide over here in Europe is not as common as in the US. So a lot of people end up going to a location and maybe take a guide right there. So, for example, in Slovenia, if you go there, the Socha Valley is pretty popular. There are a couple of fly shops, and you can either just hit them up and say, "Listen, I need a guide," or you can just also go there and then ask when you get there. Sometimes it might be a bit harder to find a guide there, but since they're not as high in demand as they might be in the US, from my experience, you can still go there and then decide, do you want a guide maybe like for just half a day, and then in the afternoon you fish on your own if you know the river a bit by then. It's very flexible from my experience.
And how about the licensing scenario? How does that work for each location? Is it different, or is it
Yeah.
pretty standardized?
That's a good point. That's sort of a challenge in Europe in general. So to break it down, for example, if you want to fish in Germany or Austria, Switzerland, it's a bit stricter. For example, in Germany, you have to have a fishing license, like a proper exam that you take normally to be able to fish. And then you need a permit for the lake you want to fish or the river you want to fish. That's only a little different if you want to fish in the sea, for example, in northern Germany. The regulations are a little less strict. It's the same roughly in Austria and Switzerland, but they do have like tourist permits. So it's a little easier. And then if you go to Italy or Slovenia, for example, you have to buy a license for a certain river. But that's most of the time very easy. You buy it in a local fly shop, and it's not very expensive. So most of the time, it's probably something around, let's say, $20 to $50 a day.
And is a lot of that? Can you get that done online before you travel, or like some of those
Depends.
exams and things like that?
Yeah, I mean the exams in Germany, if you live here, you have to get it, otherwise you can't fish. So it's like a state license that you have to get. But if you're a tourist, I know a lot of places by now offer like special permits for, let's say, a week. So if you're only traveling there, you might call up like the local administration and ask for that, or you can often also find it online. It's pretty good by now, but it's hard to, say it in a general statement because some places might do it differently. Most of the time, if you want to go to a certain area, try to call up a fly shop or look it up online, write them an email, and they are most often the best resource to, get you started.
This sounds like a great piece of content for a researching journalist.
Yeah, I've spent so much time on doing that and trying to help people with that because I'm used to that in a way. I've done a lot of research in my life and a lot of nitty-gritty research.
Yeah.
But I understand for Americans, often it's very hard to understand that, for example, if you want to fish in Germany, it's not like for you guys, if you just, go to a fly shop, buy a permit for a certain, even a state, right?
Right.
And you can just go and fish. So it's a bit more difficult in Germany, but still it can be done.
Yeah. And I'm sure you've got, friends that come in to visit you and they're like, what do I need? So you do all the research and here we go.
Exactly. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. So let's jump in. You and I were kind of chit-chatting before we fired up here, and you rattled off 10 or 12 different species that could be targeted in and around the Munich area. Why don't you kind of roll through that list a little bit, and then, let's talk about some of that, and then maybe pick a couple to get into some more detail on how you like to fish for them.
Sure. So Munich, to give you an idea, is about 60 miles from the Alps. So we have a lot of nice rivers flowing out of the Alps. A challenge nowadays is that a lot of those rivers, the bigger ones at least, they have hydropower plants. So a bit of what you guys face in the US as well, with dam removal movements. There is more and more discussion over here about removing dams and, making the rivers better. There is a European legislation that forces the countries that are part of the EU to improve the rivers and small creeks and lakes. I think it's by 2027. So what it's nice to see is that a lot of governments now put a lot of effort into improving river situations. So for example, removing dams, removing sediment from rivers so that fish have better conditions to spawn. And that has really improved a lot of rivers and smaller creeks in my region where I live. So you can fish basically for trout, mainly in rivers, right? Just like you guys do for brown trout and rainbows. And then some rivers have char as well, which are fun to catch on a fly rod. And then if you want, you can also go for pike on a fly rod, which are pretty popular by now. In the rivers that I fish around Munich. And then there's also a lot of pike fishing in the northern part of Germany. And
is that more lake fishing for pike?
Yeah, like smaller lakes, and also even like brackish water, where in the Baltic Sea, where it's pretty shallow. The pikes even enter the brackish water, and they grow really big there. So that has become quite a popular destination for a lot of pike fishermen from Germany and even from countries like the Netherlands and the Scandinavia that go there, especially like in autumn, and fish for big pikes, because it's a bit like flats fishing, although you don't see as much, right? It's not like such a visual fishery, but still, you stand there and cast and catch big pike be above 40, 50 inches in pretty shallow water. So it's a pretty exciting fishery. Yeah. Huh. And then, what I think is very particular about the Alps region is really the marble trout. The marble trout is a species that is endemic to the southern Alps region, so Slovenia and northern Italy mainly. And there are a couple of rivers in the Trentino region in northern Italy, and then also Slovenia, that are just, pristine rivers. And the great thing about marble trout is that they grow really big. You wouldn't believe it, right? They're like rivers that are 30 feet wide, chin clear, and you have the chance to hook up a marble trout of up to 40 inches. So like really big fish that from my experience, you just wouldn't expect in those rivers, right?
Right.
And like chin clear waters. You can sight fish them, it is possible. I mean, obviously, with such a big fish, it's not every day that you catch them. And a lot of fish are probably going to be in the 20 to 25 inch range, but still they're an amazing species to catch on a fly rod, right? They have this beautiful coloring and they're wild fish. So I think that's one of the most exciting things you can do. And, like we mentioned before, with, Munich being a good place to fly into, it's just like a 4-hour drive from here. And then from those beautiful valleys of Slovenia, it's like a 2-hour drive and you're in Venice. So I feel like for an American, for example, if I were to put together a 1-week trip in Europe, you could easily bring a fly rod and fish a couple of amazing species, all within like very close range. Because, just to give you an idea, then to go from Venice to Milan, for example, it's 2 hours, 3 hours maybe in a car.
Right. So you're getting both sides of it, which is, I think, great. I mean, I love traveling and experiencing the local culture and seeing all the architecture and amazement from that perspective, but then also being in that natural resource of the river. And I mean, the hair's sticking up on my arms right now thinking about it. It can be pretty incredible.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, we're much more densely populated in Central Europe than, you guys are out in where you live, or in Montana or Wyoming, whatever. But what's great is that, our rivers are sort of coming back. A lot of effort is put into restoring them, and it's really picking up. So I would feel really confident about recommending an American to come over here, bring a fly rod, have a really good fishery, but then have the added benefit of, spending the night in Milan and then next day go up into the Alps for 2 hours and have an amazing fishery for trout or grayling or whatever it may be. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how about if you were going to take one rod, would you take like a 5-weight or something like that? Or what would you recommend?
Yeah, I'd probably take a 5-weight. I mean, with a 5-weight, you can cover all those species that I mentioned: brown trout, rainbow trout, marble trout, grayling. You could even fish for perch with it if you want it. That we have, in a quite abundant way here in small ponds, and they're really fun to catch on a fly rod. If you wanted to size up, there's that fish you mentioned at the beginning. That's another sort of dinosaur from the Ice Age, the huho, which is basically like the European taimen. And for that, you would definitely have to bring at least an 8-weight. I'd rather recommend a 10-weight. Because to give you an idea, they grow up to 50 inches, even 60 inches sometimes, and 50 plus pounds. So they're like big fish. They're not as strong fighters from my experience as, for example, salmon are, because, once you hook them, they just know they're really strong. And what they often do, they just move into the current and just sit there.
And hold.
Exactly. They hold, and they know for some reason, that they're probably on the stronger end, and they're really fun to target on the fly rod. And what's special about them is that you mainly try to catch them during the wintertime. So the fishing is like really harsh. It's often sub-zero, freezing, snowing. And then what's particular about those fish is that they often in the wintertime, they have very low levels of energy, and they only feed like once a week, but twice a week. And then what I mean by that is everything has to come together in a way, right? You have to put in the hours, you have to go out there, fish, keep fishing, even if you think like there's no fish in the river, because you don't see them. Like with the big marbles, right? They're like, I don't know, 40 inches, and they're like ghosts. And once you hook them, you're like, how could I not
Where was
see
that?
them?
Yeah.
Exactly. And what's great about them, sometimes, you see them move out of a pool or into a pool. And then again, from my experience, often you don't even spook them. Again, because they know they're top of the food chain, they're like, I'm just slowly moving in there. And it's just amazing to see them. And even in Munich, like if you look down from one of the bridges, like in Munich, we have the river Isar, which flows out of the Alps. And that's really spectacular to see, because in April they spawn. And so you could Munich has 1.5 million inhabitants, right? But in the city center, you can see the huho play and spawn. It's an amazing sight, and it goes to show, how well these populations sort of still manage to survive despite all the challenges they have to overcome with hydropower and what I mentioned before.
Yeah.
And that can be a spectacular kind of fishing that you can do in Slovenia. You can do it in southern Austria. You can also go down to the Balkans and Bosnia has some really good hucho fishing. And that's something, that I always tell my American friends if they're like, what kind of fishing can you do over there? That's exciting. I'm always saying like, marble and hucho. That's something, once you experience it, I'm pretty confident to say you're going to come back for more.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's come back to that because we're going to wrap up the show on some of
Yeah.
that technique. But while we're talking about the Munich area and some of the other, standard species of trout, etc., can you identify let's talk about 3 different rivers or locations that you just think are really unique to the area?
Yeah.
That if you came here, these would be where I would probably want to, focus on to get an incredible experience.
Yeah. So, to give you a better idea of the big rivers flowing out of the Alps, it's not always easy to get access to them, right? A lot of them are owned privately or by fishing clubs. So if you wanted to come here and go fishing here, for example, if you go from Munich to Switzerland, it's only about like a 2-hour drive by car. And you drive towards the Lake Constance, which is like a huge lake. And they have a couple of tributaries there with good trout, and they have amazing lake trout in the lake. But I'd probably recommend, easiest would probably be to get in touch with me if you have like a real interest in fishing there, because then I could, look at the time of the year, the current conditions, and recommend you something. Because out of the box, it's really hard to say. A lot of those rivers are like rivers, a bit like spade rivers, right? So, for example, if the river's been harsh, you can't fish them until like late July. A lot of them then fish really well into the late fall, but it's really hard to give like a general recommendation. It's more on a case by case basis. Okay. Same goes for like, the border of Austria and Germany, which again is only like a 2-hour drive or not even from Munich. And you could go to a place that is right at the border and run by an online shop. They have a great experience, if you want to fish there. It's called Rudi Heger. I can provide the, in the show notes for you. If you ever want to go there, they have amazing trout fishery. And these guys know everything about the area. They have a couple of rivers that they run, and they could, very well tell you, go fish that river one day and then maybe the other one the next day, depending on the water levels. Because then, again, depending on the time of the year, it can vary a lot. So it's hard to say, go for this river. It's on a case by case basis in a way, like I said.
Yeah. They're probably all dependent on snow pack for the year, rain runoff, etc.
Exactly.
But it sounds like you've got quite a few areas where you can go to, and there's multiple river systems that could facilitate different times of
absolutely
year
absolutely.
Or weather.
In Switzerland, for example, it's great because there you can buy a license for a county. So it's a bit like you guys have in Montana, for example. So you buy a Montana fishing license, you can go fish, a vast amount of rivers. It's the same in Switzerland, in that Canton Graubünden. It's like the biggest county of Switzerland. You buy one permit and you can go fish, the River Rhine, for example, in its upper stretches. It's an amazing river. You can go fish it there. You can go fish small alpine lakes. You can fish small creeks, all with one permit. So that's something that I definitely recommend, because it's just a vast variety of fish that you can catch. And it's a place that I've been going to since my childhood, basically. And I remember that a couple of years ago, the Swiss brown trout record was caught in the River Inn on a fly rod. And I think it was a fish of 40 plus inches and 20 something pounds. Amazing old brown trout. And you can go there and fish it with like a public permit.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
What we get caught up here in the States with Euro nymphing. Everybody Euro nymphs, and it's not the case. I mean, there's still a lot of clink and dink and dry fly fishing, etc.
Yeah.
Can you kind of talk to that a little bit?
Sure. Funnily enough, I experienced Euro nymphing pretty much for the first time, like in depth, last year when I was fishing the Deschutes in the US, right? I was fishing for steelhead, and then there was one guy, and he fished with a Euro nymphing setup. He caught fish like a machine. I was like, it almost feels like cheating, right?
Yeah.
And so I totally get it. And I know in tournaments, it's hugely successful. But I have to say, I personally, I love swinging a wet fly. I love swinging a streamer. I love fishing it dry and seeing a fish rise to my fly. So if I were only to go for efficiency and catching fish, I think Urinum thing is hard to beat, right? But
Mm-hmm.
what's great, for example, about the small alpine rivers that I talked about, I often fish like an elk hair caddis because I
Mm-hmm.
love seeing my fly bounce on the surface and then a fish come up. And that's the style that you can fish also, for example, for marble trout, right? You can sight fish. And I just find it so exciting to watch my fly and if I
Yeah.
see a fish rise, try to make the perfect cast, have the drift, go in the right way and the fish go for it. Whereas, with the urine nymphing setting, obviously it's super effective, but I've added to my repertoire, but it's not my go-to technique because I just feel like, I like making a longer cast, good presentation and stuff. So
Right.
I totally get it's very effective, but I've still stuck, with classic techniques in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm of the nature where I like to really dive into a technique.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll admit, I dove headfirst into the Euro thing, and
Yeah,
man, it is effective. But
it is.
if I can dry fly fish or if I can dry dropper,
Yeah,
I'm the same way. I love to see that eat, etc. I
yeah.
will say, for me personally, the Euro style of fishing is far more interactive and attractive than fishing with an indicator.
Uh-huh.
Because I feel like I get an element of that dry fly experience because you're paying so close attention to your indicator line, and you can see those subtleties, or you could be so accurate with it that you're in the zone and you're really like, okay, I'm getting the right drift this time.
Yeah.
So yeah, pretty
No,
pretty
like you're
neat.
saying, I mean, I 100% agree with you. It's if somebody does it well, it's art, right?
Yeah,
Like you're
yeah,
saying, you have to watch very closely where your line is going, the drag you're getting and stuff. I never fish an indicator because I feel like I've never really gotten the point. I get it that at some rivers it makes total sense because you otherwise you might not see the take. But like you're saying, if somebody knows how to urine nymph and watch that fly line very precisely, I think it's a skill for sure.
yeah. And there's so many techniques around it. Like you
Yeah,
can fish across a river, you can
yeah,
fish straight upstream,
yeah,
long leader, short leader.
exactly.
I
Yeah,
never even thought it would be that complex, and it's like
yeah.
you can
No, it
really
is.
change it
It
up.
is.
Yeah,
Yeah. And
and
then
then
some
you
people fish
switch.
it with a dropper or without.
Right,
You
right.
can mix it up.
And then you go into the dry fly technique, and it's like the same thing, right? Over again, where you're like, okay, am I long leader? Am I short leader? Am I in a small creek? Am I big bug
Yeah,
to weighted
yeah.
nymph to, oh man,
Yeah.
we
I
could go on
just,
for days.
when it comes to dry fly fishing, what I enjoy so much is that often I catch myself just going to a river and, watching the fish rise for like, I don't know, half an hour before I even start fishing.
Right.
It's, I try to understand their patterns, like how they rise, when they rise. And I remember one instance last year, I was fishing the East Branch of the Delaware River in New York with a friend of
Mm-hmm.
mine. And,
Yeah.
we got down there to the river, and he had told me that they had stopped stocking the fish a couple of years ago and that they had some really nice wild brown trout by now. And what we experienced that night was that it was getting darker. We saw a couple of good rises. I started casting to a fish, and I made about 20 casts and I didn't catch the fish. I made good casts. I felt like the drift was right, but it just didn't work. And I was like, what am I doing wrong? Should I change my pattern? Is it about the presentation? And then I stopped casting for a couple of minutes and I just watched the fish. And I realized it's always going in the same interval, about 20 seconds. And it's basically never changing its spot. So it's basically just standing where it's standing and zipping the flies that drift directly at it, right? A bit like railing fishing, what we do quite a bit over here, where you basically have to get the drift exactly right because it doesn't move to the left and it doesn't move to the right. It just
Yeah.
takes whatever comes, right into its field of vision.
At the right
and
time.
at the right time, at the right speed. And since the flies were abundant there, I had a hard time, putting my fly in the right spot at the right time. But in the end, I caught the fish about 20 casts later, and it was so satisfying because I told myself, I'm going to stick with that fish. I'm not going to move position. I'm not going to try to cast to another fish because I knew the fish was taking flies, and it was up to me to figure it out. And that's what I like so much about dry fly fishing, in a way that you see your errors. If the fly starts dragging, you're like, man, you didn't get the cast right. But then when you do get it right, it's such a nice learning curve in a way, because the next time you're going to be like, if there's like another little current that I have to get my line over, or I've got to do a mend or whatever, I really enjoy those challenges. And then, if you come out on top, it's even the more satisfying.
Yeah. It's a really unique problem solving scenario, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you really are, if you break it down to the most simplest term, it's like, okay, here's the problem. It's right in front of me. I have most of the evidence, but what am I going to do to kind of open my mind and unravel all the moves in my repertoire to solve the problem? And I love how you spoke to the scenario of, I know it's eaten.
Yep.
I'm not going to. One of my good friends always says, well, I don't really like to leave fish to go find fish.
Yeah.
Right. There's one right there. It's feeding. Let's solve that problem and really attack it. And it takes some mettle. It takes some mettle to do that, because if it can be super frustrating, watching, oh gosh.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that you're talking about the Delaware, because I had a guy on the show, Joe DeMaldorez. He's an excellent angler out of the Delaware.
Yeah.
And one of his specialties is fishing emergers. And that's often a problem with caddis. Is they look like they're splashing and eating dries, but they're eating emergers. And great.
Yeah. To the same point, I once had a discussion with Ed Van Put, that you might know as well. He's this guy from the Delaware as well, and I think he's kept the record of all the fish in the last 5 decades that he caught. And I did an interview with him last year. It's on my site, and we got really nitty gritty about which flies he's using, and he's basically saying he's using, I think it was an Adams, like 90% of the fish that he caught on an Adams, because he felt like that's the best imitation. And then we talked about leaders, we talked about colors of the fly line, and he said he's a strong believer in white fly lines. And I was like, why is that? And he's like, have you ever thought about the color of the belly of animals that try to go unnoticed in water? So for example, ducklings or frogs or whatever. And I love that idea, that he had gone so far to think about, why would white be a great color? And we had this discussion, and I was like, if I had to pick one fly that I would have to fish for the rest of my life for trout, I would go for the klinkhammer, that you might know as well, right? It's by Hans van Klinken, a Dutch fly tyer that I had the pleasure of meeting once. And I think, to the point that you just made with the emerger, I think the klinkhammer is sort of the fly that ticks almost all the boxes, right? It's sort of a dry fly, but it sits in the surface.
A little low. Yep.
Exactly, a little low. And often I found myself going to the klinkhammer when everything else didn't work. And I often ended up catching fish that had refused all the patterns that I had tried to seduce them with before. And the klinkhammer is just one of those flies, that has worked well for me. And in such situations, I feel like it's a bit like in sports in general. Confidence plays a big role, right? That you feel like you can trust your setup because you've tried it 30 times, and it might make you change your fly, change your lead or whatever. But from my experience, it's often not that. It's just, piecing together the puzzle, like you just said before, understanding, what's happening here, how can I change it? And then when you get it right in the end, it's just so satisfying.
Yeah. It's funny you say that, because I have a tips episode on the Adams. Because a lot of people start out or the advanced anglers, you get into this whole, I need all these flies in my fly box. And the tip is about, hey, just go tie 3 or 4 sizes of Adams and tie it in a light gray,
Yep.
and then take a couple Sharpies.
Yep.
And you'd be amazed
Yeah.
at what you can accomplish
Yeah.
with that from a fishing perspective, because it's the silhouette, it's the size, it's the
Totally.
shape in it.
Yeah.
If you can get really proficient at that, then being able to really match the hatch, et cetera, down the line with different flies, it makes a big difference. And
I agree with you. Yeah.
I love the white line scenario too, because the other thing, the immediate thought I had was, you think about water and the light reflection on water, like as a kid being in the pool and looking up, it's those white lines, right? So it would look a little more natural. That's pretty neat.
Yeah. And to the point you make, with the flies, I've always found myself going to the river with like less choices in terms of flies. Because what I found is that oftentimes, especially fishermen that are not as experienced, or fisherwomen, they have a hard time making a decision. So they open up their fly box, they're like 100 flies in there, and they're like, well, which one am I going to choose? Whereas if you narrow it down, like you just said, most of the time I bring like 2 nymphs, a couple of dry flies, and maybe that's it.
Yeah.
And then when you're in the situation of trying to trick a tricky fish, it makes it easier because you rather work on your presentation, which from my experience is much more important than, maybe going for a lighter gray or a darker gray, and you end up, changing your flies 10 times instead of spending that valuable time on improving your presentation.
Right. And so what I like that too, because what you end up is in a scenario of less time with your flies in the water, or less time actually observing and seeing what the fish is doing on its feeding habit.
Yeah.
Less time on all those more important items that are indicators of success than staring in a fly box and going, oh my gosh, which one do I try now? Right.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Am I in the zone? Am I?
Yeah. And from my experience, I've basically always found that if you've gone for a fly, you've made your choice, and then you get your drift right, your presentation right, I've very, very hardly experienced that the fish didn't take. Right? If your presentation is good, I feel like, if the fish then does not take, okay, I give it to him. But most of the time, it's all about the presentation, I would say.
Yeah. They're opportunistic animals.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
If you fall back on that, I think you're right. If you're putting it in the right place, you're getting the right drift.
At least when you see them feed, right? I mean, if there's a fish that you're not sure if it's taken anyways, but like the situation I just explained, if it's actively feeding on the surface, it's up to you to get your presentation right, from my experience.
Yeah. How many times have you seen underwater footage of fish eating, and they eat everything from grasses and mosses to all kinds of things? How many times have you pumped the stomach of a fish and there's only been one kind of bug in there? There's often maybe a more dominant, but there's almost always more than one type of bug. And I try to remind myself of that regularly, because you can get stuck in that mental process of, oh man, they're only eating emergers, or they're only eating this, or they're only.
No, I know what you're saying. I feel like it happens, at particular times of the year. For example, over here, we have a pretty strong mayfly hatch. Mm-hmm. And then, sometimes it's all they go for, because they're just sort of in the zone. But like you're saying, most of the time, I mean, I don't know the statistic, but from what I remember, I think trout take like 90% subsurface. So dry fly, it's a rare opportunity to catch them on the surface. But like you're saying, most of the time, if they're feeding, they take whatever looks like a good meal to them.
Right.
If they're not feeding, it's harder to trick them. But I feel like if they're feeding, very often, it's the same in sea trout fishing over here. If you open their stomach, they often have like small crustaceans, maybe like a snail, then like a small bait fish. But they go for a lot of different sources of food in a way.
Right. And in that scenario you described too, of where they're really keen in on something, normally you're prepared for that anyhow, because
Yeah.
this time of year it's green drakes. We're going to be fishing
Right.
green drakes, so I got my drake box. I mean,
Yeah.
so yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
we're gonna jump from
Yep.
this scenario as much as I could talk about this all day. We're gonna jump back to Slovenia and talk about techniques around marbles and then
Yep.
some techniques around the hoo-hoo.
Yep. Yep. So, for a marble trout, they're pretty much like a brown trout in terms of targeting them. So, like we just mentioned, there are occasions you can catch them on a dry fly, but I would say most often people probably catch them on nymphs. And from my experience, it's often that the smallest flies catch the biggest fish. You wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
believe it, right? So
Mm-hmm.
often people pick like a bigger nymph pattern because they feel like, yeah, I'm going to throw it in there and then the fish is going to see it and it's going to go for it. Often, from my experience, the bigger the trout, the smaller the flies they take. I've had the discussion with other people before, and talking about midgets, for example, you have those tiny flies, and you catch
Yeah.
trout that are, I don't know, 25 inches, and you wouldn't believe they would even bother about such small flies, but they do. And then another technique that can be very effective is streamer fishing. From my experience, that's the case when the water level is like a little high, either like rising or falling, but still like a little murky water,
Mm-hmm.
because that's when they get a little, less cautious in a way. And sometimes they go for the
Yep.
big bite.
Feel a little
And
more protected, maybe.
yeah, exactly. And I feel like, those big predators like the marble or also the huho, they have excellent eyes and they use that to navigate in the murkier water. And I feel like, they're more prone to attack like a small bait fish when
Right.
the water is not that clear.
Yeah,
And
long
so
lateral lines to feel the vibrations. And
exactly.
okay.
And from my experience, for big trout, not only marble, but from big trout in general, if you're fishing a streamer, I, use a pretty traditional technique that they use in salmon fishing, for example's way. So you just cast it across the river, like 45-degree angle, and then you just let it swing. And often I've had the experience that they take the fly at the end of the swing, right? Just before you start stripping. I don't know what it is. I feel like, that the movement is probably at its most natural and maybe like wiggling a little in the water. And
Yes.
exactly,
That
they
last
often
little.
follow it. And then when it comes to like a small stop at the end of the swing,
Mm-hmm.
that's when they go for it. And it's the same for hujo as well. I've had instances where, you cast to them, often in clear water, like big streamers. You can, depending on the setup you fish, but I often fish with like a two-handed rod.
Mm-hmm.
And you can cast big streamers, 10-inch streamers, not very heavy, but,
Yeah.
still, castable in a way. But big streamers, and the hujo, they follow it. And, sometimes they take it and sometimes they won't. Sometimes they follow it up to your feet. And it's an amazing sight because, like I
Yeah.
mentioned before, those are fish that
Yeah.
they're huge. Like I've caught a couple of them in my life, and still I'm sort of, when I see them, I'm almost frightened. I'm like, how can such a fish be in a river like that? They're
Yeah.
monsters, honestly.
Wow.
And it's
And
just
you're
a
using like
very,
a pike fly almost, it sounds like.
yeah, very, very similar in a way, right?
As much flash as a pike. I mean, pike flies usually have a lot of flash and
opinions vary. I've had good experiences with darker colorings,
mm-hmm.
so brownish. I've also used sort of like big mouse or rat imitations.
Mm-hmm.
They've
Mm-hmm.
worked well for me. But some people use like very flashy colors, like bright orange, yellow. Again, I would feel like it depends a bit, on the river, the time of the year, the time of the day, the
Right.
watercoloring. So, but again, with the hujo, from my experience, and I would say it's pretty much the same for like the big marble. If it's all about being in the right spot at the right time. Those
Yep.
fish, they don't grow so big for no reason.
Right.
They're very smart predators. That's what happens with the hujo often. They're so smart, they follow the fly and they just don't take it. And you're like, I intrigued that fish. Why did it not take? From my opinion is that they're smart. They're smart
Yeah.
hunters. They know something is wrong. So, everything has to align in a way to catch a fish like that. But then if you do, it's really like a unique sight.
Yeah. They're like gators and crocodiles too,
Yeah,
in that they eat a gazelle and then they go lay down for a week, and then
exactly,
it's
exactly,
like you only
exactly. And you
have
can,
1 or 2 opportunities a week per
right,
fish, and there's not a lot
right.
of fish in the river of that
Yeah,
magnitude. Yeah,
exactly, exactly. They have like a range in the river that they patrol in a way,
yeah,
and you can swing by a big streamer right by them. They don't even bother. They don't
yeah,
even look at it, right? And then
yeah.
when the timing is right, all of a sudden you make a cast, the fly barely lands, and they smash it.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's a very particular type of fishing, and I think that's why not a lot of people do it because doing that kind of fishing during the wintertime, sub-zero, freezing,
Yeah,
snow, wind, maybe, wow, it's harsh.
yeah. It's like
It's harsh.
steelhead fishing here. I mean, it can be
Exactly,
brutal,
like
right?
you're saying,
Yeah,
it's a very similar type of fishing, I would say. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. It can be brutal. It's really hard mentally to stay in the
yeah,
game, stay
yeah,
focused.
yeah,
You're limited on your shots. It could be
yeah,
devastating when you miss something. I'm sure you get grabs
yeah,
or
yeah.
nudges and things, so.
Right. And with the hujo, I'm not a big steelhead fisherman, so I don't have a lot of experience there. But the hujo, for example, they have a very hard mouth. So
Hmm.
even if you use like a big saltwater hook, a big strong hook, often it just doesn't set. And so you have to do like a strip strike to even set the hook. But often you're hooked into a big fish, and all of a sudden it sort of spits out the hook, and you're like,
Hmm.
how could that be?
Do you
Right?
use like a saltwater, like a circle hook, almost like a tarpon hook?
I use
Um,
like a big gamakatsu saltwater hook. I don't
mhm.
tie them myself, but I have a guy in Italy who's an amazing fly tyer who tied a couple of them for me. And I've lost a couple of hujo on weaker hooks.
Mhm.
So a couple of years ago, I went to like strong saltwater hooks that really, they can't be, how do you say that, bent
Bent
in a way.
out. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I
because
would.
that's so bad. A bit like steelhead fishing. You hook into them so rarely that you don't want to lose them
Yeah.
because of like a weak hook or whatever.
Right. 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 It's
Uh,
like take all the errors out that you can. Right.
yeah, yeah,
Well, Leonard, hey man, it's been great having you on the show.
it
Learned
was a
quite a bit
pleasure.
about traveling in that zone, and you're a wealth of knowledge. We're all better today from hearing your insights. So I appreciate it.
Yeah,
If people want to get a hold of you, is thewaitinglist.com the best way to go about it?
exactly. That's a good way to get in touch. Also on Instagram at the waiting list, or just shoot me an email at info@thewaitinglist, and I'll make sure to get back in touch with any travel tips or whatever you might need.
Okay, great. And I think what we do is maybe get back together here again soon after Iceland and hear about your trip.
That'd be really nice. I'd be glad to share my experience.
Okay, well, let's plan on a trip report, everybody, from Leonard here, and go check it out, thewaitinglist.com. Great publication. It's free. The publication's free. All kinds of insight on the fringe aspects of fly fishing and gear reviews, etc. Looking forward to connecting again here, Leonard. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week. And tight lines, wet nets. We'll see you soon.